So,
Oh,
Liam, good to be with you, man. Episode 14, or is it 15 now? We're on
15 actually, I think. Was it 14?
15,
Yeah, 14 was the one with
with
Jonathan.
Dr. Bilal. Yeah, Dr.
Yeah,
Jonathan
so
Bilal
we're up to
Abdullah,
15
which
now.
was about mental health, and I hope everybody enjoyed that episode. And today we're talking current events, election, kind of where we go as a community. How do we build change as a community and on a unified front? And we're just going to riff, man. We're going to just talk about topics that I think are important to the audience. Look, y'all may agree with us. You may not agree. That's not the objective here. We're going to be real with you, and you may not think it's real. You may think it is real. It's up to you. We're not here to force our opinion upon you. We're giving you our opinion. And so if you take it, great. If you don't, that's up to you. Because at the end of the day, you're going to go on YouTube or Podbean or Apple, Amazon, wherever you listen to us. You're going to listen to us for a little bit, and you're going to go about your day. And you're going to say, you know what? I appreciate what they said, or those two guys are knuckleheads, for lack of a better phrase, and you're going to move on with your day. You can heed our advice. It's entirely up to you. So welcome, Liam. Thank you. So let's get into it, man. I'm excited about the discussion because it's going to be fluid, right? Organic discussion. We're just going to talk about current events. And the first thing that's on everybody's mind, and I've been seeing a lot of people talk about this on various platforms, thoughts on the election. You know, how does this election land on you, or the outcome of the election land on you?
Okay, result, that is. Yeah, gosh, the way this played out is sadly pretty predictable. Honestly, if Trump had not won this one, somebody very like him would have won in future, because this is the direction that the Republican Party has been taking for decades. It's been steadily building up to this. By this point, even the people who consider themselves to be mainstream conservatives and not MAGA America First conservatives are already so much farther right than the Republican Party was in the 70s and early 80s. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here is the long-term transformations that started in the Goldwater era, accelerated under Reagan, and have been building in the base ever since. So even as a lot of the major politicians were a little more wary about this kind of far-right populism, the Republican base and its the pundits, the media for them, like their ecosystem has been drifting more and more far-right for a long time. So it's quite significant there that somebody like Trump was going to be electable again. But I think it's worth noting to people too that this election does hinge on a few specific issues, because the number of votes that Trump took in this election is actually no higher than he took in 2020 when he lost. Now, granted, 2020, he had more votes than he had in 2016. So there are more people who liked him. And even though some of those voters this time around got a bit more disillusioned, his performance actually among Hispanic and African American males actually climbed a little bit, quite significantly among Hispanic males, but a little bit among African American males. But that isn't enough to make any real statistical difference. You know, given population growth, he should have more votes than he does. And his vote total is almost exactly the same as it was in 2020. So he did not win this so much as Harris lost it, because more of the Democratic coalition that would normally show up for her did not show up.
They shifted to the Republicans and shifted
for
him.
No, they didn't. That's the thing. They just
didn't show up, period.
Yeah, it didn't show up because, again, his totals are the same. There's no actual overlap there. It's just that people simply didn't vote. And I know a lot of people, and even some of our comrades and colleagues were hoping that more people would vote for like the third party candidates, you know, the socialists, the Greens, or whatever, things like that, you know, the small party type ones, but they didn't. Their vote total is the same as it always is. You know, the Greens did again about 0.5%. So it's not that a different party. They just didn't bother, or they maybe did protest votes. They wrote things in something, but they just didn't participate in it or skip the presidential ballot. And that's not altogether uncommon. I mean, that's quite honestly what I didn't vote for president on that. I mean, there's no point, because I can't support either of them. And honestly, in California, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Harris was going to take California no matter what I did. But I just skipped it because I could not in good conscience support either candidate. And I knew it wouldn't actually affect the election. If I lived in a swing state, I probably would have held my nose and voted for Harris, but I don't. So
right, you and I both live in California, and that wouldn't have made a difference. And you're right about the third party candidate, because I think the closest person that's ever gotten to even the needed amount of votes was in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt.
yeah,
That's
exactly.
the closest a third party has ever gotten. And I recognize the need to do a dissent vote, but it had no significant impact. But I think what's important.
It's not the reason. People are, and there's always going to be people, especially the hardcore Democrat types, your blue MAGA types, who are going to tell you, it's voting for the third parties that did it. It's impossible. If every single vote for all the third parties, that includes a bunch more, honestly, more people voted for RFK Jr. than voted for the Greens, and he wasn't even running anymore. He was just still on the ballot because he withdrew too late. But if you took all of his votes, all the Green votes, all the Libertarian Party votes, and they're quite far right, throw them all together, Cornel West, the PSL socialists, put them all together, give them all to Harris, she still loses.
Yeah, it was a significant. There was a significant difference in the amount of folks that turned out for Harris versus who turned out for the Republicans.
People just didn't show up, and there's honestly several good reasons for that.
I was going to ask you, why is that? Why do you think?
Well, the biggest one is one that we talk about a lot, and one that the media, and this is a good one for any listeners here, the media is going to downplay this massively. They are not going to talk about it because it's not in their interest to talk about it. But it is the main reason. Because again, think about how this works overall. They did not shift to Trump. They did not do anything else here. They simply didn't show up. So what is that? What kind of protest is that? There's a particular type of protest strategy that's involved here that is tied to an issue that you and I talk about a lot, sir.
Yep. Go for it.
You want to
tell that we talk about quite a bit. I think it's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's the Palestine conflict. This is something that the media does a lot to downplay, to make it look like it's just some extremists. It's a few people, or it's an ethnic issue. So they talk about how, this is going to affect things in Michigan because there's a lot of Arab Americans there and blah, blah, blah. And like maybe thinking that people are only voting in terms of ethnic interest, which is honestly pretty damn defensive and racist in itself. There are a lot of good people who care about this and cannot hold their nose and vote for somebody who is actively supporting a genocide. Now, the argument is often made, and it is true, and we should talk about it, Trump will be worse for the Palestinians in some ways.
No doubt. I've always said that.
There's a couple of places where we can build on mistakes he will make, and I'll talk about that too, so I will give some silver linings, but it will be worse. In the short run, things will get worse in this. And we should be aware of that. But I don't know, the analogy I often make for people, right, is if you're looking at two terrible figures, right, and it's like a totally absurd scenario, so forgive me for that, but okay, so everyone knows that like your Hitler type figures are terrible, right? I mean, his politics are explicitly racist, pro eugenics, all kinds of awful things, but a far right nationalist. And then you have Mussolini, who is also a far right nationalist, right? Running the fascist state in Italy. But the fascist state in Italy was not explicitly racist or eugenicist. It was still, though, far right nationalist and imperialist and everything else. And Mussolini was actually guilty of a genocide in Ethiopia, where they used poison gas against the indigenous population to seize control of the territory. They conquered the country with tanks and poison gas, like the chemical weapons. So Mussolini, not a good guy. Like anybody who's like trying to like defend him, no, it's terrible, right? But arguably,
we know what happened to him.
Hitler, right? Does that make sense? Like, so Mussolini would not have like killed all the Jews of Italy or something. That was that kind of like racist policies inside Europe were not his plan. Now let's apply that to domestic politics in the U.S., right? Harris is definitely better on a lot of domestic politics than Trump is. Definitely better on a lot of domestic politics than Trump. Still terrible on plenty of issues like the border, where she is essentially a far rightist, or on issues of like crime. And, like there's tons of issues where she's quite bad. And honestly, as far to the right, honestly, Harris is on issues like the border much farther right than Ronald Reagan was. So there's still a lot of areas to criticize her, even on domestic politics. But her domestic politics are better than Trump's, period, full stop. However, she has actively supported a nationalist genocide abroad. So to me, it's, again, totally absurd, but I would say, like, if you're telling somebody to vote for Mussolini to stop Hitler, they're
Right.
still both awful. Like, you can't morally ask people to do that. You can say, yes, Hitler is worse. Yes, we have to stop Trump. Trump is worse. There's no question of that at all. But voting for another hard right candidate does not stop the process. This is something that a lot of Americans have been willfully oblivious to for a long time, and others who are aware of it have been gradually tuning out and not paying attention, not participating because they feel sort of hopeless about it. It's something we call the Overton window, where, like, what is the difference between the right and the left in politics, right? We talk about, oh, you're the right-wing candidate, you're the left-wing candidate, right?
Right.
And Democrats are what? There are left-wing candidates in the US, right? The
Presumably,
Democratic Party, as it has existed for the last several decades, is farther right than the conservative parties of Europe. So it is not fascistic, but it is more conservative and more right-wing than the mainstream conservative parties of Germany, of France, the UK. You have to look at their explicit fascists to see anything farther right. And that's where the Republicans sit. So our choices for years now have been between neo-fascist parties and conservative parties. And so the people who call themselves conservatives aren't taking Harris took the conservative position in this race. And I think that's the trick there. The more you go with that, the more it shifts that Overton window farther and farther right. So what is the left is more and more right-wing, and that allows the other party to go more and more toward authoritarianism and fascism.
I've a few comments to make on a number of things you said. So Barry Goldwater, you talked about him and kind of made the comparison to Trump. And so there was a lot of rhetoric spewed about Barry Goldwater back in the day that was unfounded, and they created the Barry Goldwater rule, right? And so Trump is completely, based on what I've read and what I've heard, is not really Barry Goldwater. That's the first thing. So I want to address that. And then the other thing you said, the second thing, I'll keep it at two things. You said people didn't show up as a result of the administration's involvement in the genocide. Although a lot of polls show one of the major issues is the economy or inflation. Why do you think they didn't show up because of that versus her inability to articulate what she would do differently as a presidential candidate versus sticking with what the Biden administration has done in the last 4 years? So which one?
Very good question. Yeah, on the Goldwater issue, it is important to note that Goldwater's own views are not as extreme as the movement that actually got him the nomination. He was often sort of surprised by and shocked by them. He would, in many ways, be a bit more of what we could call just a strong conservative, a states' rights sort of like strong conservative sort of figure. But it was a pro-segregation, hardcore racist movement that actually got him the nomination and pushed him. And it's how the Republicans began taking control of the American South. Before that race in '64, those states were reliably Democratic. They were reliably Democratic votes, and had been for a long time. What ends up happening there is that the pro-segregation camp drifts over to a states' rights sort of issue, and starts reframing a lot of the things there. They start talking about, okay, so issues that we are still dealing with today, like school choice, i.e. the charter schools trying to break public schools, that started then as a ways to have whites only schools, right? They were trying to build that up and build support for it. And it's also the beginning of something that Reagan would make much better use of, the drift among the evangelical, the right-wing evangelical Christian vote starts drifting more toward him. Goldwater was often kind of aghast at the people who were backing him, but he was willing to do it. And he himself had a number of really problematic views, like, for example, voting against the Civil Rights Acts. For him, it was based on the principle that states should determine this, and he didn't think that he was being particularly racist in it. But you have to know a lot of states like Mississippi were going to be really bad without those acts. So it's tolerant of it. What he's opening up is a space for tolerance of far-right racist views in the mainstream of the Republican Party, the party that originally had campaigned on a solidly liberal and almost center-left position and had opposed racism there. Think back to like the radical Republicans of the 1860s and 1870s. The Republican Party has fallen very far from that, and it starts with Goldwater's movement. A little bit less himself, if that helps to clarify there. But that movement ends up finally finding the perfect candidate for them in Reagan, and they almost tried to run Reagan. Well, they did, but not really successfully against Ford in 76. And they finally got him the nomination in 80 because Reagan was everything they wanted. Reagan was an explicit white supremacist, but a better communicator. Goldwater's kind of like crusty and kind of like, irascible. Like he wasn't as likable. Reagan's like, everyone's like cool uncle or something, but also has a Klan hood in his closet. So,
well, he was described as one of the best orators of his time. I mean, Reagan was.
Right. He was an actor. I mean, granted,
exactly what I was
going to
say.
On his own, not particularly clever, but he was very effective at getting them what they wanted in a way that Goldwater couldn't be. But the Goldwater movement in the first place is the same thing that gave us the Reagan Revolution, and it's a long-term process that builds up. Honestly, I think the best person who deals with this stuff is Rick Perlstein. He's done 4 volumes on this now, starting with the Goldwater Revolution and taking us through the Reagan era. And there's a lot of places where his work on that drift, I connect into a lot of my work on the global resurgence of far-right populist movements, i.e. the neofascism, which is something that Perlstein doesn't talk about, but he shows the massive drift in U.S. politics toward strongly racist candidates and positions, a lot of the shifting rhetoric and whatnot. So it's more complicated than just saying Goldwater did this, but it starts in that race.
Give us the name of the book. You mentioned Rick Perlstein is the author. Do you know the name
of the
book?
There's several of them. The Before the Storm is the first. You can find Before the Storm is the one where he's talking about Goldwater, but then you've got like let's see, Invisible Country, and then is it Nixon Land or Nixon Land and then Reagan Land. Like he used the same kind of sense there. The way that Nixon managed to hold control of the party. Honestly, this is a weird one for a lot of people to think about because Nixon is a terrible figure in U.S. politics. Like, probably clinically paranoid, really problematic in a lot of ways, but he was in some ways trying to hold to the Eisenhower legacy of modern conservatism as opposed to the far right racist one. But when he lost in the 1960 race, for him to jump back in 68 after Goldwater and win, he allowed his strategist to adopt a lot of Goldwater's techniques. So he's sort of like straddling the line. In some ways, Nixon is the last truly liberal president we've had in this country. And in other ways, he's a bridge toward the far right because he allowed them to oversee strategy and shift a lot of his priorities. He started off calling for universal health care, a universal basic income, all kinds of things that would have helped ordinary Americans, and dropped all of that shit and adopted the far-right economic policies that his advisors wanted. And those far-right economic policies, the introduction of a lot of that stuff is tied to the racist drift.
So I appreciate you highlighting that. So let's address the next question, which is, so if you look at all polls and what's important to the U.S. or this the country, inflation and economy, yet you talked about people not showing up as a result of where I see that's an irrelevant point. Let's talk about the economy and inflation. How do you think that impacted people showing up and not showing up and not being able to differentiate ourselves from the current administration?
Yeah, there are 2 other issues that do play a part in this, but generally speaking, when you see significant opposition on those kind of policies, people will cross over. There's always people who can, Democrats will vote for Republicans, Republicans will vote for Democrats in every race.
Mhm.
And those are often on issues like how the economy has been handled. And they'll think, well, things are bad right now, so let's give the other party a chance. This is always a little tricky because any kind of economic policy difference tends to take quite a few years. So it's usually later administrations that the changes really are happening under. But it makes a certain amount of sense for people to think, well, things are bad, ergo they are bad. Let's try the other one. But we didn't see any movement like that. There's actually no lateral movement from the Democratic base into the Republican base because Trump's numbers are exactly the same as they were in the last race. He actually lost some support and then picked up a few on issues like the border. Honestly, some of his border rhetoric is appealing more and more to some segments of the population that didn't before. And this is another one too that's just as an aside, because I said that there's two other things that do kind of matter here. A lot of polls are showing that somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of Democrats, and depending on the poll, and sometimes a little bit less, but there's a significant share of actual consistent Democratic voters and registered Democrats who hold exactly Trump's far-right views on the border and on militarizing the border. And this is something that people like Harris were often trying to appeal to, trying to show, hey, or Biden has continued building Trump's border wall. And, Biden, like Obama before him, have been deporting large numbers of people too. And, and actually expanded. This is another one that just blows my mind that Americans pay so little attention to. All those concentration camps that Trump started building up for migrants. Biden has expanded that, and there are more of them. We have literally hundreds of small concentration camps filled with migrants that we're holding in detention, and that's just not how this stuff used to work. It costs tons of money. It's not effective, but there is a share of the Democratic Party who cares about that. So some of them may have felt, well, I can't vote for Trump because Trump stands for this, that, and the other thing I don't like, but I really care about these two issues, inflation and the border. So I just won't vote. That the inflation one is probably a larger share of that. Of people who chose not to turn out on that issue. But even there, usually in both cases like this, in things like the border or in inflation, usually the people who have that as their single biggest concern in terms of picking a candidate would crossover votes. In this case, what we have is a significant drop in the total coalition numbers. There's about 10 million people that just did not show up. There's a huge number of people that simply did not participate in this race. And since Trump made combating inflation a centerpiece of his campaign, if that's a reason for people not to vote for Harris, it might be an indicator that would suggest, well, maybe Trump's support would go up or that person would cross over to it. And I don't think we see enough of that to be the single biggest issue. But any of these, there are tons of other factors that would, affect anybody's given vote.
Sure.
So it's definitely going to be one of them. And costs have gone up. And honestly, Harris's policies on this are not helpful at all.
Yeah, well, cost of goods have been up. Inflation's down to 2.4, which is much better than it was a year plus ago, where it was 9. But the cost of goods are still expensive. And I think you and I talked about this.
Yeah.
People are still getting paid the same.
30% above the pandemic.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And so people are tired of not being able to pay their expenses and not being able to pay, rent at a fair amount or buy a home. Although the Fed just reduced rates again by a quarter. And so you talked earlier about the media distorting the truth as, hey, they normally do, not really talking about the main issues, obviously for various reasons, especially this genocide. Is there any, so I think that's an important topic because it'll never be touted in Western media that there's a genocide going on. I always believe any U.S. administration is going to support Israel hands down. So I think that's a good segue. Unless I have something else that we want to cover.
It connects to the media point, but also I think it's a good one to end on the election type issue, at least. I mean, there's obviously a lot of stuff we need to talk about in terms of like what will come from it, how it will affect Palestine and things like that. But okay, so economic policy. There's a basic point I try to make here, and this especially when you have when liberals will come at me and say, "Why didn't you support Harris?" You know, like what's the issue there? And it's not just the principle of like, "Hey, I can't back somebody who's giving a whole bunch of money to somebody actively engaged in far right violence," but the economic policy is another big one there. And this is one that's hard to explain to Americans and ones that the media will never actually talk about, because the media will point to things like inflation numbers and like job, the number of jobs being produced and like total GDP growth. And these three things do not fit the real economy that affects most Americans. They're the kind of useful number points that the media can talk about and say things are going well. But for ordinary people who say, well, yeah, but like the cost of my groceries and fuel and everything else is up 30%. So I'm feeling a pinch here. I don't really give a shit that Wall Street's getting record profits, because when they're talking about the economy, they're talking about the federal inflation numbers. They're talking about GDP growth. They're talking about job growth. They're talking about the size of the markets and market caps and all that stuff. But that isn't what affects people's pocketbooks. And this is one point that I like to make about the neoliberal drift in the Democratic Party. As the Republican Party began adopting more and more of that Chicago school type neoliberal views, they dragged the Democrats with them. That's why I mentioned things like the Overton window. And both of them actually support the same neoliberal consensus, which means that on economic issues, Biden is actually very far right. He's not a far right candidate in the sense of like a Trump or like a fascist or something, but on the economy, on specifically economic issues, much farther right than most Americans would want the country to be, which means that you're defending corporate profits, their right to gouge us. You're defending, the banks and the lending policies and everything tied to that are affecting people there. You're defending all honestly, the way that costs have gone up, because a lot of it is simply they're taking advantage of it. There were supply chain crunches during the pandemic, and I've seen a lot of great economic analysis of this showing, okay, so this should affect prices by about this much, but it actually affected prices by this much. They raised prices more than they needed to make up for that. And then after the supply chain corrected post-pandemic, they did not lower the prices to where they were. They kept a lot of things much higher than they should be.
Because they can get away with it.
Milk us. Yeah, they're milking it for all it's worth. Oh, people got used to that. They're surviving. The whole economy hasn't collapsed. I guess I can make more profits. And then they take that money and dump it into like stock buybacks and everything else that do not help in any way. This is one of those neat things that come up a lot when people talk about U.S. tax policy. And so setting aside criticism of the system itself, let's look at how this kind of capitalist economy would work, right? If you want corporations to pay workers better, invest in research and development, expand their businesses, grow their businesses, actually grow the real economy, then you need tax rates to be very high on them. The personal tax rates on the rich need to be higher, and the tax rates on the corporations need to be higher. And you can see that not only in other countries that manage this better, but in U.S. history. When we had a 91% tax rate on that top 1%, they invested more. They founded more companies. They grew more companies. When you had it was like in the 60s, something like that, when you have very high corporate tax rates, they invested more. They produced more jobs because they figured, well, the government will just take the cash. But there are these tax breaks if I spend the money on research and development and invent new things. If I spend the money giving my workers more pay there, then it becomes, income that you're writing off. It's not going to something. And it has the added benefit too of actually making the business larger. So see, here's the thing. If you have a business that makes X amount of money and it's going to pay a very high tax rate, right? Then you're still paying a very high tax rate. If you invest some of that money into growing the size of the business itself, then you're still getting a smaller slice of that cash for yourself because your personal tax rates are high, but there's still more of it because the business itself grew.
Well, you're right. Like you said.
Oh, sorry.
like you said, you're writing off versus having to pay
Yeah,
Uncle Sam.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the write-ups, as well as if the overall pie is larger, you still get a bigger piece, even if you're still paying a lot in taxes. You have to grow the size of the pie. What we've done in this country since the 70s and 80s with the drift into neoliberal economics, and this affects both parties, is we have shifted to what you can almost call a kind of vulture capitalism, or what we call finance capitalism in more technical terms. Because what's more in their interest now is not growing the size of the business, not building companies like General Motors and General Electric and IBM and these massive conglomerates that have tons of employees and make all kinds of stuff. That's not in anyone's interest anymore. What's in their interest is to buy up other companies, strip their assets, lay people off, and then you do stock buybacks and dividends for shareholders. So the shareholders on the finance side make lots of cash, but ordinary people who depend upon those jobs and all that stuff circulating in all the money circulating in the economy, they are screwed. And that's the problem we've got here. A lot of people the more people get aware of this stuff, the harder it is to actually support Democratic policies when they're honestly no better on the economy than the Republicans are. And there used to be economic differences between the parties, but on basic issues, they simply don't exist. They both support a lot of the same stuff that has harmed our pocketbooks, the money that's available for us, but has made the top 10% much richer. Since the 1990s, all economic gains have gone to the 10%. We are barely keeping up with the living standards we had in the 1970s, if you adjust for inflation and everything else.
And I'll add two things to that. I think the tax plan of Trump that expires, I think, in 2025, when cutting corporate rates, the intention was to cascade that money down to the employees, but that didn't work.
Right.
But and that didn't work effectively. It only benefited corporations.
That's the only thing about this. They absolutely know it, because you've got Trump's tax cuts, you've got W's tax cuts, you've got Reagan's tax cuts. Not in every single case, research and development money fell, and money spent on employees fell. What increased was stock buybacks and dividends for the rich. Yeah. So it's they know what they're doing that way. And so yes, Republican policies are worse, but the core commitment to Chicago school neoliberalism is quite strong among Democrats. And it does mean that there's not as big a contrast between them on economic issues or on things like inflation. It's very hard to say this will be much better for me versus this. You can say Harris is much better on a lot of issues than Trump is, but it's really hard to say that it's going to actually result in a significant improvement in your living standards. And the bigger problem is the long-term trend. The more we support and reward the neoliberals on the Democrats and not having a genuine alternative to that, the more it keeps shifting that Overton window farther and farther right. So it while again, the Republicans are the ones embracing neo-fascist ideals, not the Democrats. Democratic policies, specifically their economic policies and border policies, are helping to shift everything farther and farther right. And that it takes, again, the US completely out of balance. Like every other developed democracy has real choices in their election on significant policy issues. We do not, because we only have two viable parties, and both of them are significantly right-wing. And again, the Democrats are literally more right-wing than the conservative parties in most of the world. So it is a really stacked choice for us.
I want to go back to, Harris and why people didn't show up. So you talked about the administration's complicity in the genocide. So I have 2 points to make to that. I think one, her showing up in media interviews. You know what? I want to use a simple example. You walk into an interview, right? One of the first things, or even a performance evaluation, you've been in the administration for 4 years. And for those of you listening, I'm sure you've heard this question before. And so the first question is going to be, what are you going to do differently? You may have criticism of the person that puts you in as a VP, and you may be tentative to respond and be adverse in your response, but you can still respond and say, hey, I appreciate the opportunity that was given, but here's what I think my administration will do differently so that my constituents are impacted positively.
Right.
Do you think that had an impact on her, the way she responded? I wouldn't do anything differently. We always hear that as simple as a response.
Yeah. That's key there. It's, again, she ran on his economic policies, his border policies, and his Israel policy, and downplayed anything else, really. This was not actually, and this is, it actually reminds me a lot of the way that Clinton conducted her campaign, because unlike Harris, Clinton actually had, and was forced because of Bernie's candidacy and the people writing her platform, she had a very progressive platform, but she didn't talk about it. What she talked about was Trump is bad, Trump is dangerous, vote for me instead. And Harris did the same thing. It was more of a contrast, like, this side is much more evil than me, pick me and not that evil. And that's, at the end of the day, that kind of fear-based rhetoric is something that really works on people much more inclined to conservative thinking in the first place. You know, like, it's the predispositions to being afraid of difference, afraid of change, afraid of foreigners, and blah, 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 all the kind of stuff that they talk about. It's not a really good pitch to left-wing voters. It can affect liberals. Liberalism, it, again, should be noted, is a right-wing ideology between center-right and hard-right, depending on whether you're talking about, you know, classic liberal versus libertarian, whatever there. But liberalism is on the right. But the Democratic coalition includes swing voters who explicitly identify as leftists.
Yeah.
And to identify, to draw them into the coalition, you have to differentiate. You have to point, you have to give them something. You know, give us some kind of carrot that says you're different. And on those kind of things, when you're instead making that contrast, vote for me out of fear. Well, fear is not a big, I'm sorry, folks, fear is not a big motivator for left-wing voters. You know, we care about policy issues. We care about things like foreign policy and economic policy, and, you know, what you're actually doing for the working class. And she simply didn't campaign on it. She had opportunities to differentiate herself and to actually talk about substantive policy issues. Here is how I will improve things. Here is how I am different from Biden. And in most cases, she punted. You know,
I think that's an important call out for people who are listening. And again, no judgment on the VP and who she is, but, you know, her party, the DNC, didn't do a really effective job. And I know they had a short period of time to come together, but you're vying for the highest office in the land. Your prep work, your ability to articulate yourself as to what's going to differentiate you, is essential when your constituents are listening and have had struggles economically the last 4 years. And I mean, if you're going up for a CEO job, you know, one of the things the board's going to ask you is, what are you going to do differently than what the prior CEO did to increase revenue, to cut expenses, to help retention, which is similarly to how are you going to help your constituents remain financially stable. None of that came to fruition in the discussions, not to mention your complicity as an administration in the genocide that's happening in Palestine. My last question, and we can shift to the selections that Trump made. How much because this often comes up and people say, well, she didn't have a lot of control over the decision-making that Biden made in terms of support of Israel. So talk about that a little bit. You know, how much influence could she have had in the decision-making process about supporting weapons export to Israel? Because what we're seeing now, and I think the U.S. is between a rock and a hard place, and their credibility is getting diminished. We'll talk about that even more. Is now they're saying, well, we've put this plan 30 days. They haven't executed. Oh, well, what are we going to do now? No big deal. But they're going back and talking about the 1976 Export Act, the Leahy Law, and the impact that has on the export of weapons to a country that's actually using it in an act of genocide. But before I move on to, let's talk, how much influence does a VP have? Let's just start there with the decisions the president makes. And
there's two parts to that, because constitutionally, the vice presidency is, in the words of a famous candidate for that in the 19th century, worth a warm bucket of piss. it's not actually valuable. It doesn't do anything. The vice president has two jobs: break a tie in the Senate and wait around for the president to die. They have no actual other constitutional power. So what influence they have depends very much on who's in charge, because their authority stems from the person that is there. So you can devolve things to them. You can give them. Think about the way that W gave a lot of authority to Cheney. The actual authority was still W. Bush's, not Cheney's. Cheney had no actual responsibility, but he devolved powers to him to act in his name. And the DNC made a conscious choice in the 2020 race to refer to the Biden-Harris ticket, and referred for 4 years to the Biden-Harris administration, which is unusual. We usually talk about just the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration. They consciously connected her to it as a way of dealing with the fact that everyone knows Biden is a very old man, doesn't speak terribly well. People had some worries about him. They wanted to know that there was somebody with a strong hand on the wheel. That will be Harris. That was their argument. Now, you can say in hindsight, well, she didn't actually make policy, and you can lean on the constitutional side and you say, well, she couldn't. He had the final choice and everything. That's true. But in their messaging for 4 years, they made the argument that she had a hand in everything, that it was a joint administration, and that she played a part in crafting all that policy. That was their choice in messaging to do that. And that there's a consequence of that, because it ties her explicitly to all of his policies. And on specifically the Israel-Palestine one, we know she's a committed Zionist. She's made statements along those lines for many years. And she has said she would not change this stuff. It would be the same kind of like, naughty, naughty, you shouldn't do that. Please be nicer to Palestinians. And I love that you mentioned the 30-day thing, because that was honestly interesting that Biden even said that. You've got 30 days to comply. But everyone is saying that in 80% of the issues, they got worse, not better. And what has Biden done? Here he is, a lame duck president. He's going out of office. There's no possible consequence. He could cut off aid. He won't, because he supports the Israeli far right, and so does Harris. And that is an important distinction to make here. For anybody who was worried about that, trying to give Harris the benefit of the doubt, trying to give Biden the benefit of the doubt, here he could do something. Even if it's only short term, even if it's only for a couple of months, he could cut off aid and start and do censure motions in the UN, anything. They won't.
Yeah, that's a good call out. The last question, actually, I do want to, how much of a negative impact did her nominee for VP, Walz, have on her campaign?
Honestly, I couldn't say. I don't think that it had. I don't think that it played a negative part at all that I know of. At least from my understanding of it, I don't think that it was harmful. I think that it actually was a much better choice than the one that she was the things that she was leaning toward originally. There are problems with every candidate, but I don't know that he played a significant part in her loss. I think what hurt her most was Biden being an albatross around her neck, all the Biden era policies, everything that has been done for 4 years that people have issues with.
Got it. So let's transition to Trump selections for various offices. I don't know where to begin, man. I think it's a freaking circus with a bunch of clowns running the show. That's how I see it. And I think personally, it continues to diminish the credibility of the U.S. In the short term, it has a significant impact on the Palestinians. In the long run, I think his nominations are going to show how inept they are, and the global community is going to turn on them. That's what I see in the long run. But in the short term, I think the Palestinians, especially with Mike Huckabee, and the guy, the Secretary of Defense, who's going to be running the Pentagon, the Fox. That's how funny this is. And
the guy that threw an axe and went over the top and almost hit somebody. Like who staged that? Like,
I mean,
really,
this is a guy in Trump that's been diagnosed malignant narcissist. And I think he's trying to prove a point that I can do whatever I want, select whomever I want, and you all have no say. I wouldn't be shocked if these folks passed the hearings to get appointed. I wouldn't be shocked. What are your thoughts about these selections?
Those are all great. As I think you're right about nominations. It will be relatively difficult to stop a lot of them, given that they do have control of the Senate again now. So that helps to grease the wheels for nominations. And it's historically, people often do vote to confirm appointees of the opposite party. There's a lot of barriers against that. People are afraid of well, it just holds it up and there's nobody for a long time, then they can't do their job. And they think, well, somehow it's better to have somebody doing the job than nobody, which honestly is a bad idea. Because the departments will keep working regardless of whether there's a head on there. Most of those bureaucrats are there all the time. It doesn't really matter. But a lot of Democrats are still going to vote to confirm Trump appointees just because of the way that they tend to think still in terms of, old school politics, well, we got to support the other guy. We got to country first. He's picked them, whatever. And then they're not really paying much attention to the damage that's done here. That's a problem we've had for decades in this country. So I expect he will get most of his appointments, and some of them are horrifying. But I don't know. Okay, so clown show is actually a nice way of thinking about this, as well as a lot of stuff that happened under Reagan, Nixon. Honestly, I mean, there are so many criminal indictments among Reagan appointees. It's still a record. It's astonishing how many people actually were prosecuted and went to jail because of his appointees. They pick people they know are bad, that are going to damage the departments they're running, because if you can run a department into the ground, you can make a case to people to abolish it or privatize it somehow. And that's what they've been doing for decades. They're trying to get more and more oligarchic control of government. This is one of the reasons that Sheldon Volin coined the term inverted totalitarianism 20 years ago. It's describing a direct corporate capture of government, that instead of a kind of classic totalitarianism where the state is all and everything is subordinate to it, instead the state is captured by an oligarchy that then pulls the strings, and we only have the fiction of a democracy. This is where countries like Russia are today, what we technically call a managed democracy, where you have votes, but they don't really matter. They don't change who's in charge. The U.S. has been on this trajectory for a long time now, and Trump is an active part in that. When he talks about draining the swamp, he's lying, because he's appointing swamp monsters who are doing exactly the same thing that Bush-era appointees, that Reagan-era appointees were doing. It's the same basic trend there. The only difference is he also includes some far-right populists. There are some neo-fascist voices there, and some genuinely dangerous people like Huckabee. For the specific issue there. There are some outliers on that, but the overall trend in picks still is going to fit that basic trajectory of how can I privatize government and make sure that the rich are always in charge.
Yeah. So speaking of Huckabee, very, very pronounced in his beliefs on the Palestinians don't exist. That's been his narrative. Totally opposed to a two-state solution. And now we just have Mostrich, who has been emboldened even to say we're going to annex the West Bank. And I think part of that, to me, all right, so you've been called an apartheid and occupier, and I say this regularly. How do you remove that label? Well, you ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and you control both Gaza and the West Bank. It becomes settlements on both fronts, and you're no longer an apartheid system, and people can't argue that anymore. That's basically what you're doing. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. Am I overlooking? Am I overthink? I don't think I'm overthinking this, or am I underthinking it? But you got Huckabee now, who's going to be the Israeli ambassador. For the short run, you're right. Palestinians are going to be adversely impacted. But in the long run, I think the global community will continue to see the lack of credibility of the U.S., especially after they just conceded the accountability on this 30-day action plan that they implemented, which was basically a pacification until the elections were done. So thoughts on Huckabee and his approach to the Palestinian-Israeli issue?
Well, as a short one first, just in terms of international community, People have not taken the U.S. terribly seriously for a long time, as far as what we would say, and whatever. They know we're a violent empire, but they're forced to take us seriously because we are still the largest single economy, and by far the largest military power. So we have a seat at the table regardless, and it doesn't matter how many European countries oppose us. There's no way in hell they're going to war with the U.S. There's no way in hell they're going to do anything adversely. And because of the way the UN was structured with the vetoes for 5 members, there's no way to punish the U.S. We have repeatedly ignored world court rulings against us for decades. So like the courts, international law say you did this wrong, you owe these people money, and we're like, tough shit. What are you going to do about it? We got all the aircraft carriers. So yeah, there's very little that can be done there. But yeah, the anger behind closed doors is going to continue to increase. People are honestly fed up with the way the U.S. does things, but there's nothing really they can do about it yet. We're a long way away from being able to right that in any way. This is not a multipolar world. As far as like Huckabee, honestly, so there's a couple of important ways to look at this, I think. One is his views on Israel are still ultimately anti-Semitic, because what he's hoping for is for Israel to control all that territory, recreate a religious state, and rebuild a temple, and that will provoke a massive war with the Muslim world that he can then view as the apocalypse in his own religious views. And in that apocalypse, of course, nearly all the Jews die, and the remainder convert to Christianity, blah, blah, blah. Jesus comes back, everything there. Like that's his view. Like that kind of understanding, that particular form of Christian nationalist Zionism only develops in the 19th century based on misreadings of Revelation and a number of other things. It's not a very old idea, but it is a strong one on the American hard right evangelical side. And they ultimately want Israel to become a halakhic state, a temple monarchy. And there are people inside Israel who are actively trying to do that. Those are the allies that people like Huckabee have. When Huckabee says there are no settlers, he's being serious. He doesn't think that they're settlements, because he accepts both from his own Christian nationalist Zionist position as well as the Israeli religious Zionist position that they are redeeming the land, sanctifying the land. They're putting Jews back where they're supposed to be to recreate ultimately a temple monarchy. Now, Israel's a long way away from being able to do that. A lot of its own population oppose that, but it is a significant threat. There are ways, though, that we can kind of use that. Now, assuming you, the audience, everybody doesn't think in these apocalyptic terms that we want Jesus to come back and millions of people to die, because I'm honestly hoping we don't have an apocalypse, but
right.
millions of dead people. But yeah, setting that aside, there are ways in which the annexationist rhetoric can work in our favor. Because while they may want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, I love that you mentioned that. And I'd love to talk more about that, because they do want to remove people from it. They're talking about that, right? But this is one way in which the rest of the world doesn't want to play ball anymore. If you go back to, like, say, 1948, 1949, there was a Syrian leader who said, hey, you know what? I will absorb 300,000 Palestinians and make them Syrians as long as you sign a peace treaty with me and give me access to Lake Kinneret. Yeah, and Israel said no, and then he got deposed and it didn't matter. But there were people willing to play ball. There were people willing to like do that, to sell out the Palestinians. I don't think the surrounding countries are willing to take millions of Palestinians at this point. They're just not. So what are you going to do with them? They either have to murder all of them, and I don't think anyone's going to accept something along the scale of the Holocaust, or they have to try and get rid of them somehow, or they're stuck in that country. So what Huckabee's policies will ultimately lead to, if Israel annexes the territory outright, it will be more explicitly an apartheid state, because it will have those Palestinians still there. And at that point, I think the real struggle for Palestinian liberation can begin. Because as long as we're still talking in terms of a two-state solution on the 67 borders, I think we're wasting our time. If we can, if that territory is annexed and is legally part of one country, it is legally one country, then what we have is a civil rights struggle akin to South Africa, Northern Ireland, things like that, where you're campaigning for actual equality. And campaigning for equality in the country to end all of the ethnocratic elements of Israel effectively restores Palestine. It makes it the way it would have been if it had always been a secular democracy. So I think it allows us to shift to a South Africa style struggle with massive sit-ins, strikes, boycotts, hunger strikes, huge protests like that. Like, do it like the U.S. civil rights struggle, like shut things down, cause massive disruptions. But it takes away the possibility of the diplomatic approach, the way that they've tried to negotiate with the Israelis. Can you please give us a little bit of land for our own? That was realistically not going to happen. And in some ways, I think we on that pro-Palestinian side can exploit assholes like Huckabee's ideals if an Israeli government is stupid enough to annex that territory. Because if they take all that territory, I think the Palestinians can wage a significant struggle for full equality in that country. And that's where in your book club, the way you're reading like the nonviolent struggle, things like that.
Yep.
Or like Chenoweth's research on nonviolent struggles. If you start applying those kind of techniques inside a single state, it'll be a lot more effective than all of the fighting we've seen for decades to try and carve out that territory and make it theirs.
And for those of you listening, if that does happen, annexing the West Bank, there's no way in the world that they're going to give the Palestinians citizenship, because then the impact is the demography is out of balance. It no longer is an ethnocracy. It's no longer a Jewish state. So bear that in mind as you hear Liam talk about the legal annexation if it happens under Mostrich, and then Huckabee supports it. And I think you called up a good point. So because we've talked about that in The Quiet Revolution by Mary Elizabeth King, the nonviolent struggle in the 1920s, all the way leading up to the First Intifada. But that was the Palestinians with a few cohorts of the Jewish community and other allies. But now you're talking legal annexation, one state, boycotts, hunger strikes, civil disobedience, that I think can get louder among the global community, and we can't go for this anymore. We have to change the narrative. And so in the short run, yes, negative impact with Huggabee's selection. But as you articulated as a Christian Zionist, and although people don't see him as an anti-Semite now, his end game is what you talked about, which is the apocalypse that he's looking for at some point in Jesus returning. And so for you Palestinians, my brothers and sisters and allies, it's going to be a tough road ahead, but you have to persevere, right? We have to persevere together. And that's where we're going to get to next, is how do we build a community of allies that helps us move forward? Because people, Liam, they're tired. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, especially with the new IPC report that came out, that indicates northern Gaza is under IPC 5, complete famine, mortality, and other governance of Gaza are in 4. And then so barring that, because I think the Palestinians are struggling more than anybody else, not even the allies as much, but how do we stay focused? How do we persevere through this and stay committed to the cause? Your perspective.
Yeah, and this is one that honestly I really want yours as well, and I really want us to talk and think about this, but because it is difficult, and there are ways in which I am simultaneously very optimistic and very, oh gosh, I mean, it's hard. It almost seems like a kind of like fatalism in it, but it's really not what I mean. But it means I think we need to be more aware of the obstacles ahead, of how difficult this is. And there's a way in which not only politically, but just on a personal level, on like an emotional human level, it's very difficult to think long term, because we're apes, we focus much more on our immediate interests, like taking care of family, feeding ourselves, like what's important right now. We are capable of long-term thought, but it's not a natural wire. It's difficult. It requires effort. And when you understand that, you understand the difficulty of keeping people engaged long-term in struggles and focusing on actually viable strategies for it, because it's easier always to fall for like the short-term rhetoric. This is honestly why people fall for demagogues in the first place. Everyone's got, I will solve this, boom, put me in power. And we were like, oh yes, you will solve the problem, because you're thinking very short-term. You want an easy answer. We always think about all the get-rich-quick schemes and everything else. Everyone wants an easy answer to things. That's our natural wiring, but we're not constrained by that. We can do better. And I think in issues like this, we have to be willing to think about the long-term struggles and how we can get there. I don't know if that makes sense so far.
It does. It does. I feel there's a couple things that we need to keep in mind also, whether it's the plight of the Palestinians or other marginalized group. Change is going to be incremental. At the outset, it's going to be difficult. There are going to be some hardships. There's going to be some adversity we face. But we need to stay the course through several ways. One, continuing to educate people, right? About the cause, about things that we can do on the ground, get involved with nonprofits, local representatives. And I think for me, staying out of the nonsensical conversations that fuel fires that are unnecessary. I see quite a bit of stitching of videos on why people didn't vote for this individual, why this person didn't vote for. You got to stay away from that nonsense. I recognize there's hardship as to the election results. I get that. I'm not denying that, but I think we need to focus on the cause. So recognize that education, incremental change, that's what we need to celebrate and continue to move forward, because you're right. We tend to be short-sighted in our vision. We want instant gratification. Can I see change now? No, you cannot see change. You cannot rely on immediate change because it doesn't have longevity. And so I think those are important aspects. And you have to talk, I've always said this, you have to talk to your centers of influence that feel this is a complex issue, because they've not done the research to fully understand what's been going on, whether it's the Palestinians or other marginalized groups. And again, not to discount people's ability to go and do research and understand what's been happening. And so I think those are the things that we need to recognize. And again, I'll go back to what I said first. Look, you're going to see some difficult conversations unfold in the next several months. You're going to see some things continue to happen that are difficult to the Palestinians. I get that. And people are going to be mad. And I don't blame them for being mad and frustrated and hurt. Just don't let your frustrations and your hurt overshadow the purpose of your voice and the cause. I think that is something we need to keep in mind. And that's what I would say. I mean, look, we have some tough roads ahead, but out of those, it's funny, tough roads ahead, but I'm reminded of a quote by Van Gogh: normality is a paved road. Everybody, it's easy to walk through, but no flowers grow on it. Right. And so nothing is normal about what we talk about. So if you want normality, go down a paved road. If you want change and you want to be the catalyst of change, go down a road that allows flowers to flourish and you face adversity and challenges, right? We all need that.
Reminds me of one of my favorite Emerson lines. That do not go where the path may lead. Go where there is no path and leave a trail.
You got it.
Not following the road is the way forward here. And that's the thing is we keep repeating the same mistakes. We keep repeating the same strategies. Simple fact for Americans specifically, you can't vote your way out of fascism. It has never worked that way. There's always a lot more to it. You don't get out of a problematic system by just voting for more of the people who helped to make it possible in the first place. There is a lot more to this that has to be done. And as far as like the Palestine issue too, another thing to keep in mind that it sounds bad, and I like that you're saying, okay, it's going to be a hard road, but there is if we are blazing a new trail here, if we are working the right way at this and not repeating the same mistakes, think about how in both Northern Ireland and South Africa, things got considerably worse before they got better.
Yeah.
They just did. It built up. Things. It's true in so many struggles for national liberation. I mean, think about the way that the Algerians had to face down the French Empire for independence. the techniques used against them, the napalming of villages, the mass torture, like it was horrifying. But in the long run, what it did was it energized enough of the population to make Algeria ungovernable. And that's what we have to do. If you guys want real change, like the simplest thing to point to is to say, make yourself ungovernable. We have to resurrect in the US a spirit of civil disobedience that we used to have, that we've lost a lot of. You go back into 19th, early 20th century, we had significant movements willing to challenge the status quo, willing to break laws to do it. But if you want a demonstration, if you want to like rally for Palestine, and you're doing it like we're going to file for permits for it, we're going to show up exactly the way that they want us to do it, we're going to be like super non-confrontational, just wave our signs. It's not enough of a disruption to really affect policy. It's just showing there are some people who believe this. Cool, that's great. Get more people to believe it, and then occupy the bloody street so no one can go through. Actually causing disruptions like that is hard because it's riskier for us. And to do that, it takes building a larger movement. This is why I'm always saying organize, organize, organize. Build for the long term, because our numbers are noticeable. And I think this election is one of the ways you can see that. But it's not enough yet to really get people out on the streets because people are afraid. They don't, people are, this is one of the consequences also of neoliberal policy is you keep people, that half of Americans can't survive a $400 emergency. Like there's a significant 60%. Problem in this country. Right. So how do you tell people like you have to risk losing your job? You have to risk going to jail for this. People don't want to do it. The risks are much higher for us because we don't have significant mutual aid and community support networks. If we can build those kind of organizations, so I would know that if I get arrested and I'm not here, someone is going to come and take care of my house. There's a communal organization will all pitch in money and make sure that the bill is paid or whatever. So I don't lose everything for like chaining myself to a tree or something, like there's all, because there's risks involved in that. And what we've seen in the last half century in the US is the people who are more willing to take those risks are either young people who don't have much to lose or people from very privileged backgrounds. It's a lot harder for working class people to stand up for themselves now. We need to somehow change that ourselves and organize effectively so that the numbers that we have growing can actually get out there in the streets and make a difference.
And I think part of that stems, you talked about the younger generation, millennials in particular, are more socially aware than the older generations, I think. And then the risk and reward. Because part of that is a lot of corporations nowadays, Liam, you get involved in a cause that that's not favored by the country as a whole, you get ostracized or you get doxxed, and then you're potentially going to lose your job. And so if you've got a family, you're paying a mortgage, rent, you got to put food on the table, to your point, are you willing to engage in that type of civil disobedience? And the likelihood is very slim that you do. And so you rely much more on the younger generation who has little to nothing to lose, although we want to be cognizant of their contributions and not minimize what they have to lose. I think that's an important call out. And so I think organizationally, civil disobedience, boycott, strikes, although people, I don't see it as much as we did initially, we need to see more of that. And I'm just so tired of this country acting with impunity on all sorts of things. And so for me, that, going forward, as much as I fear the adverse impact on the Palestinians and other marginalized groups, I know, like you said, the glass is half empty. I feel I'm an optimist, so I always refill that glass, right? And that's how we have to approach things, and not get caught up in the drama of these conversations.
Yeah, and on the youth, there's this is one of the places where, so not only in terms of thinking long term, because that's more a consequence of being a historian, but also the optimism. People ask me why, given how many horrifying issues I study, how can I be optimistic at all about our potential? And it's that things always do change, but you have to pay some attention to the hows and whys of it. So thinking about the youth, right? and I'll say this as I'm saying this as a second generation hippie. You know, my father was in Students for a Democratic Society, one of those like Haight-Ashbury hippies, like anti-war, all that stuff. And so I combine some of those politics naturally, but
Of course.
the youth were able to do that in part because their economic situation was actually a little bit better. If you adjust for inflation in 1965, the minimum wage for kids was $12.50. And at the time they didn't need cars and cell phones and everything else to get a job, you know. So
Right.
cost of living was overall lower too. Cost of healthcare was lower because it was still literally illegal for healthcare to be a profit-based industry in 1965. So they still had things to lose, but not as much as the youth today do. So youth today do suffer more. But it was a lot of the younger people that started the anti-Vietnam War protests, right? But think about it again, on those college campuses, in those streets, youth groups, did they change policy? The war actually ramped up and got worse all through the time that they were doing this stuff. It had to become a much wider issue. They had to energize a lot more of the population. It had to have some kind of real effect. And it had to honestly terrify the powers that be, that they will lose, you know, their own hold on power if they don't. We were closer to actual revolutionary changes in the 60s and 70s than we've been at any point since, because there were significant movements and tons of like actual mutual aid groups, people pitching in, helping each other out in order to get more people on the streets. And I think that we've lost a lot of that. And that's one of the reasons, and this is, oh God, it's too big to bring up here, but just to point to, it's one of the reasons that honestly, both parties are so committed to the neoliberal status quo. Because if we are much closer to, you know, to the edge, if we do not feel a sense of this real social safety net, we cannot actually challenge the status quo in the way that historically we were able to. But we can build those organizations ourselves, because honestly, this stuff didn't exist in the 19th century either. But people had a stronger sense of community. They lived closer together. They all pitched in money. They helped each other. You know, that sense of looking out for the people who are suffering is something that we had and can have again, and we need in larger numbers. But we have to organize in a way that isn't just based around electoral politics or waving signs or posting things on social media. We have to organize in a way that actually puts our money and our lives on the line, that actually supports our neighbors and our comrades in these struggles.
Great call out. So I appreciate that. I love these kind of discussions because, you know, it's just, we're riffing. We talked about a number of things. We talked about election results and why the outcome. We talked about the Trump selections or nominations for various positions. And then we talked about next steps and kind of what the landscape is going to look like. As we wrap up, are there any other thoughts that you want to share with the group? Because I didn't hear Gemma at all right now opine. And Gemma's the bird hanging out with us today. You can't see her on video, but you should have audio every now and then. Anything else before we wrap up today's conversation, Liam? It was good to see you too, man, by the way.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad we're finally getting back to doing this stuff, because this is fun. I do miss this. And I enjoy hearing your thoughts and questions, and you know what you're thinking about and how we can do this. And I love the spirit of optimism that you bring in. And I honestly really do like the parallels you can make between the political world and the world of business, like, you know, how we can best understand it, because analogies really help, I think, for people to understand what we're doing. Oh, I don't know if you can hear Gemma there. She's chiming in a little bit.
See, she's chiming in.
Gemma's all for civil resistance.
she agrees on the partnership. That's what it is. She opined on the partnership. Thank you, Gemma. Appreciate it. Good love.
The one of the tricks, I think, really is being able to organize effectively. And again, I think too much is put into certain types of protests and certain types of organizing that don't actually get us results. Look at the massive outpouring that we saw in the streets in the early Trump administration. Tons of people opposed to his cabinet picks, opposed to the impact he was going to have on women. Lots and lots of people in the streets, you know, cool pink hats, everything like that. Did it actually change anything? No, it did not stop any of the policies that they wanted. Things got considerably worse for women in the United States under Trump, and Biden has done nothing to restore that stuff, to fix that stuff, just like he's not fixed the problems with the border or anything else that Trump started. We have not actually managed to use our numbers in a way that shows our real power, that builds a real sense of community. And it's difficult to do that. We do have to have those hard conversations. And it has to get beyond, podcasting and standing out in a crowd and protesting with a sign. Because if we don't do that, things will keep getting worse, but they don't have to. We do have significant numbers. We do have people who genuinely care. We have people that can work together. One of the things that I loved seeing during the pandemic, not that that was great, but I'm saying like the coming together. Like, so in my area, we had people from the local masjids, the mosques, as well as like the Sikh gurdwaras and Christian churches and the LDS church and the synagogues, and everyone came together and we all pooled money together and we ran, actual food banks, like collectively, as a larger community. So not in smaller groups, but actually collaborating to do that. In disasters, there's I actually recommended this recently in a discussion online. There's interesting studies of the way that people in disasters come together and help each other out. That they, like in the wake of like Hurricane Katrina, how many ordinary people went out there and risked themselves to help other people and to save stuff, to save people and animals and whatnot. Humans are generally good at that, but we need to be able to do it when it isn't an immediate disaster, when it's more of a long-term one, and it's motivating people to take those risks, to actually organize, to put themselves more on the line than just some social media posts and flags and stuff. Yeah. I think that's the real trick for us. Anybody who's paying attention to like Gates and Gabbard and all these horrible people that Trump's talking about giving positions of power and influence, it's going to be bad, but we can make it better if we can, again, think in terms of what always has worked and the longer term.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do want to give credit. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we do see people react to escalations of violence and escalation of disasters. And I get that. But there are organizations out there, there are people out there that are constantly being proactive to mitigate some of these issues. So we got to give them credit. I'm sure you've been a part of those organizations as well. But by and large, we tend to react when things get really bad, and it's not a proactive approach. And so I appreciate you bringing that to light. It's a really great discussion today. I think we can go on for hours. Okay. But
I love you mentioned there are good organizations too. Just as a simple point here, I don't want to denigrate any of that stuff or downplay it. They exist. What I want to see is organizations with millions of members, and that's the harder part. Or significant umbrella organizations that link together different factions. I don't know, make a connection here to our discussions about Palestine all the time. Think about the way that the PLO went from being one group to being an umbrella that linked together all these different parties. Like something
VFLP,
that a general framework. Yeah, the real intersectionality, real solidarity that can take us from movements of a few thousand people in different places to like movements of tens of millions of people. And at that point, you can say, okay, fill the streets. And if there are tens, I mean, how did the Iranian Revolution happen? There were 2 million people in the streets of Tehran.
A lot of people mobilized.
That's a lot. We don't do that. I mean, think about it, if you'd had that in Occupy Wall Street, almost 20 years ago now, if Occupy Wall Street had been 10 million people filling the streets, they would have listened to us and they would have let some of that shit trickle down to us by this point. But it never built that way. So the groups are there, the energy is there, but I think we need to build them, we need to link them and go for scale if we're really going to have the larger effect there. So it's tricky, but I love that. I love that you make the connection that there are tons of really good people. There are lots of us that really do put things on the line and get involved and do things. We need to ramp it up a bit, and scale.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you joining us, and Gemma, thank you for joining us today. I know you can't be seen, but you can definitely be heard, which is a good change for us on the show. Y'all, please, we will publish this Monday the 18th, I believe. And so check us out on YouTube. YouTube, Podbean, Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. Please check out, comment, let us know what you think. Let us know if you have topics that you're interested in hearing from both of us. And Liam, as always, thank you, man, for hanging out with me today. I appreciate it, and send my best to Emily and Apo. And I will hopefully see you tonight on book club. If I think we're going to finish our book if you're available.
Oh yeah. We should be able to. Yeah.
And now it's time to conclude our show. And by the way, guys, if you haven't noticed, I did my hair differently. You know, went from putting gel in it. This is my natural curls here. They're just growing out. I asked Liam advice on how to keep it maintained, and he said globs of gel. And so I've been doing that. And today I went rogue. I just wanted to be a rebel with hair. All that said, thank you all for joining.
I'm biased. I haven't had a haircut since the 90s, so
the top hasn't been cut since May, since we went on our 25-year anniversary, Summer and I. So appreciate you all joining us today. If you like the way the hair looks, comment. Let me know if you want it. If you want it more conservative, share with gel and part it on one side or the other. Let us know. If you like Liam's hair better, let me know. I mean, that's always an option too. I don't know if I can grow it that long. And if you want me to shave my face, let me know. I mean, it's up to you. I mean, whatever you think about the episode, just let us know. Anyhow, thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you, Liam. Y'all have a great day.